Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on mastering tenant-to-tenant migrations. My name's Robert Thomas, and I head up the Microsoft 365 team here at Valto. So just a quick introduction on what we're going to cover in today's webinar. So first part is what is a tenant-to-tenant migration? We'll look at some of the common challenges, so some of the hard parts of a tenant-to-tenant migration. We'll look into the industry standard tools, so some of the tool sets that we use to migrate our resources and data over and across between tenants. We'll look at some top tips as well. Then we'll move on to a tenant migration, so a high-level overview of how a tenant migration typically works. There's also a case study in there as well. And at the end, there's a Q&A session, so any questions that you have, feel free to put them into the chat, and then we'll cover those questions at the end of the webinar, if that's okay. Okay, so what is a tenant-to-tenant migration? So this is the process of moving data and resources over from one Microsoft tenancy to another. Sorry about that. Typically occurs after organizations have a rebranding, or maybe there's organization mergers or company acquisitions. It also requires sort of careful planning and execution to make sure that the tenant-to-tenant migration goes as smooth as possible. So looking at some of the kind of workloads that we have in Microsoft 365, that would be moving over Teams, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and some of the other components like groups, and all of the other services as well. So next, we're going to look at some of the common challenges that occur when we run these migrations. So the first thing we'll look into is the complexity. We'll dive into the subscription management. So this would be your Microsoft 365 license and SKUs. We'll also look at some of the missing native APIs for the 365 products. So some of the pitfalls that occur due to the APIs not being there in the first place, or produced by or supported by Microsoft. And we'll also look at the migration throughput as well. So some of the limitations around the bandwidth when we're performing these migrations. Okay, so the first one is complexity. There are several components and products in a Microsoft 365 tenant. When you're looking at a source tenant to move over to a destination environment, there are so many other components outside of the tenancy itself. There's your on-premise infrastructure. You've got to consider all the users' devices, single sign-on applications, Active Directory. Organizations, especially enterprise organizations, will have huge on-premise applications such as Citrix and file servers. So the first one here, we've got AD Connect and SSO and SAML apps. So for enterprises, more often than not, they'll be using AD Connect synchronization, so that'll be the single source of authority for identity. Many organizations have SSO configured and SAML applications hosted in the cloud, which are used to access from on-premise. So they'll quite often be business critical applications like SAP, HR applications, and so forth. So all these need to be considered in a tenant migration, because they need to be decoupled from the source environment and moved to the target environment as well. Next one I've outlined here is device management. So this would include Intune devices, hybrid and Azure AD join devices, and even third-party devices such as Apple Business Manager. They also need to be reconnected somehow to the target tenant. With Intune, there is no real tried method for automation. That quite often requires manual intervention, either by an IT team or even by the users themselves, to disconnect the devices from the source tenant and actually re-enroll them into the target tenant. So again, it can require a lot of manpower to actually move those devices across. Obviously, hybrid and Azure AD join devices, they're required to be connected to the domain in some way, and AD Connect synchronize those up, and some group policy involved in the enrollment part there as well. Apple Business Manager, again, if you're using Intune to manage those devices, those will need to be reconnected at some point as well, and can often add to the complexity. Some of the kind of quick wins that we can do with like Intune, for example, We can export a lot of the policies using MS Graph and import them back in with things like Graph and PowerShell, but that's as far as the automation goes. Next, I've just got some hidden requirements here, so things that might not be obvious at the beginning when you're considering moving workloads across tenancies. So things like mailbox permissions. If you've got a large enterprise with several thousand seats, you'll probably find there's a lot of mailbox permissions across shared mailboxes and resource accounts that actually need to be exported beforehand and then re-imported into the destination environment. So those require planning. They also require sort of custom scripts to pull those permissions out into CSVs and things, and then re-import them back in. Next, we've got custom tenant configuration. So quite often there are all sorts of automation scripts and workloads that are present in the tenancies that need to be moved over as well. So they need to be scoped. You need a way to redeploy these with as little downtime as possible. So they also need to make sure that you take those into account. Another one is Azure subscriptions. So Azure subscriptions are tied to an Azure AD tenancy. And again, if those subscriptions are hosting resources that have an interaction between on-premise and 365, so Windows Virtual Desktop is a prime example. It's licensed with MS365 license SKUs, but it also relies on on-premise infrastructure for identity services like domain AD domains and things. And again, if there's applications and other entities in there, they'll also need to be factored in and a plan around moving those across. So next common challenge that I've noted here is actually the subscription management. So most customers now, they're on the NCE subscriptions. The majority of those are 12-month commitments. This is really all about managing cost, so minimizing the subscription overlap versus the migration deadline. Again, if there's pressure from the board level to get this migration underway, if these subscriptions have a lot of months commitments left on there, then you're in effect doubling up on the licensing cost, which can just add to the overall cost of the project itself. The next thing here is a mixture of license SKUs. So if you look at the two diagrams on the right-hand side, we've got the source tenant there, Contoso, and then there's a target tenant there, Fabricam. And we see this quite often. One tenant will have a nice set of subscriptions, quite easy to manage. So business premium in this example, this is for the core part of the business. Then there's a few E5 SKUs, which would be maybe for VIP and the IT team. And then there's some F3s there for things like frontline workers. They all contain the security features. They're all eligible to access like Windows Virtual Desktop. And then we get to the destination environment or the target tenancy, and there's a whole host of different SKUs. So you've got Office 365 SKUs there. Then there's the enterprise mobility and security packs done separately. And then things like Windows 11 Enterprise SKUs to access Virtual Desktop. And then there's just a mixture of other like Business Basic in the example here. It can be quite a complex job mapping all of the users to those destination subscriptions if they are completely different, especially if you're trying to align the license features between the two tenants as well. This does increase the time to build, and you have to kind of really make sure that you're doing a good mapping exercise there. Next, I've got Azure subscriptions. So again, this can be very complex migrating Azure resources, especially if it requires rebuilding, and then kind of deciding where the subscriptions live. And if you're going to migrate from pay-as-you-go to the enterprise agreement or Azure CSP or NCE, that also requires time as well. I've also got third-party subscriptions there. Quite often when organizations acquire other businesses, they'll have a whole host of third-party subscriptions that they're tied into. So the migration does become quite phased over time. This could be like antivirus products, things that you would in essence replace with some of the E5 capabilities, for example, when you're deploying those features into the target tenant. Okay, next common challenge. This is missing APIs. So some of the other services like SharePoint, OneDrive, and Exchange mailbox migrations, they've been around for quite a while. They've got good migration support in place from Microsoft, good APIs. So Exchange, we've been doing Exchange on premise to cloud for years now. It just uses EWS. SharePoint and OneDrive file migrations, a lot more straightforward. Again, we've been doing those for years. So cross-tenancy isn't really a problem. Where it does become a problem is Microsoft Teams. Obviously, with with COVID and the lockdown, there was a huge surge in organizations adopting 365 purely to access Microsoft Teams. So we come across lots of customers who are just using Teams and aren't using the other features quite as much. And one of the problems with Microsoft Teams is actually built up of several components. So file storage, it uses SharePoint sites in the back end, which is fairly straightforward. But that when it comes to group chat and channel messages, there's an Exchange team mailbox. And then when we get down to private chat history, voicemails, calendar, and meeting invites, they're actually hosted in the user's mailbox, which is again separate from the team. Any shared files over private chat, they also copy to the participants' OneDrive accounts. So again, something separate. And then we've actually got Azure Blob Storage for images and media shared in chats and then the content as well. And then by default, meeting recordings, they actually go to stream. So we can see here there's quite a lot of components which make up a Microsoft 365 team, and there isn't really an API available to link all those together. So when you're doing these migrations, there are actually a few caveats that we need to run through on those. There is a Teams message import graph API. So that's if you want to migrate channel posts, if you like, into target channels. That's heavily throttled. It's not an official migration API. It's just more of a message import. So you'll find a lot of migration tools will highlight this as one of the limitations. Next common challenge, which you see quite often, is going to be throughput. So there's kind of throttling and throughput across several entities when you're performing a tenant-to-tenant migration. So Microsoft 365 is going to have its own throttling mechanisms on the source and target tenants to protect the services for its customers. The third-party tools that you're using for the migration itself, they will also have their own throttling policies and capabilities bolted in there as well. Then the next thing is going to be bandwidth. So bandwidth between the Microsoft data centers and the migration tool data center as well. And then you've got to consider in there the data center locations. In many examples, we've done migrations for organizations who've purchased or acquired businesses in other geographical locations. So in this example, we've got on the right hand side, you can see there's an Office 365 tenant based in the UK. And on the left hand side, it's acquired an organization which is actually based in France. And then one of the most common tool sets that we use, the default data center is actually based in the Netherlands. So you can see here on the left hand side, the throughput starts off quite quick as it gets into the Netherlands data center, then comes out the other side into the target tenancy. The throughputs actually drop down quite a lot. This is just something that you have to take into account when you're running your precincts, for example, that the throughput is going to slow down at some point, and you just need to manage that with good project planning and decent timelines there as well. Okay. Next, we'll look at the industry standard tools for performing these migrations. There are quite a lot of tools out there now. We haven't explored them all, but we've definitely worked with some of the big ones here that you can see on the screen. Most of them, pretty much all, are going to be third-party tools. They've been around for a couple of years, and each one has got different ways of configuring things. Again, they've all got their own licensing constraints and things, and we'll take a look at some of the big ones on the next slide. So here I've got a matrix of Some of the most common tools used, obviously I've included Microsoft as a first party tool, just so we can see the comparison between what Microsoft offers and what these third party organizations are producing. So with Microsoft, they're fairly new to the game. They've only got a few different capabilities. So the first one is Mailbox, and then they've got OneDrive. SharePoint is in preview. It's licensed on a per user. And one of the pitfalls at the moment, this is quite in early development, is it requires a Microsoft EA agreement. So they're just targeting enterprises at the moment that maybe require first-party migration tools to make sure that the data doesn't leave Microsoft data centers and they can meet their compliance and regulations. As I said before, these tools are in early phase. There's going to be lots of changes to these. At the moment, it's still on the EA agreements only, but there's definitely more to come with the Microsoft first-party products there. Next on this, we've got the BitTitan Migration Wiz. This is a very popular tool. It's been around for quite a while. We've worked with this tool quite a lot. You can see in the capabilities, there are a lot more different workloads that we can move over between two Microsoft tenants. So Mailbox is an obvious one, OneDrive, Teams, which is partial, I'll explain that shortly, then SharePoint and public folders. The licensing, it's done per workload basically, so per user for mailboxes and OneDrives, and then kind of per site and per team and per public folder. It's quite easy to get your head around and to actually predict your costing when you're doing this type of migration. Just some comments around this tool. So when it comes to SharePoint, it only really migrates the files, so the actual data that sits on the SharePoint site. There's no support for like custom SharePoint development pieces. And Teams, you can see I've put partial there, so referring back to that limitations on the migration API. We can do things like scaffolding, so we can create the structure in the target tenant. We can move over the structure of the channels, the members and the owners and so forth. We can move across the files, but then there's limits then on the number of the chat and post content that we can move over. Next, we've got on ShareGate. So again, this ShareGate's been around for quite a while, and you can see here the capabilities differ again. So ShareGate specializes in Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. I would say ShareGate is more of a collaboration migration tool. So it supports a lot more SharePoint components than say BitTitan. We can move over SharePoint lists, metadata, permissions, some of the other components of SharePoint as well. It's not just restricted to the data. It's a really good tool when we work with customers who have some customizations in their SharePoint sites. You can see here one of the big things that's actually missing is the mailbox functionality. So again, it would be a combination of maybe mixing up different tools to achieve the goal here. Licensing is a little bit different. ShareGate just has a flat fee per year. So you'll pay one fee to access this product for up to 1 year, and you get discounts for subsequent years on there as well. So you can purchase the tool for up to 3 years at a time. And again, its speciality really is the SharePoint part of it. Looking at the table here, you can evidently see that there isn't actually one tool that fits all. That doesn't exist yet. So when we're doing kind of scoping sessions and assessments, help our customers move over that data, and that can be a combination of some of these tools to actually get that task done. Okay, so moving on to top tips when performing a tenant-to-tenant migration. The first one is actually just save time and money and don't do a tenant migration in the first place. So there are certain scenarios when a customer just wants to rebrand. So they want to completely move away from their current branding and adopt a whole new branding scheme, a new company name and that kind of thing. This has been around for around 2 years now. You can actually rename your tenant and you can rename the SharePoint URLs as well using some PowerShell and just changing some settings in the admin centers. A few years ago, this was not available. We had a few customers There was one in the cosmetics industry. They had to pay for an expensive tenant migration because they just wanted to completely rebrand. They couldn't have any association to the previous brand name on there as well. So we in the past we did do tenant migrations. Now we can actually help customers save time and money and just kind of do that naming, that renaming exercise, which is quite a lot quicker and has far less caveats. So that's number one. Number two, sounds quite obvious, but conduct thorough scoping session or sessions for both environments. You really need to understand what the users are accessing in these environments, because although you're migrating components in a tenant or in the cloud, nowadays there are lots of things that hook into Azure AD due to all of the great security features and so forth and the SSO apps. There's going to be a lot of infrastructure that really relies on the tenancy. So you really need to make sure that you go through both environments in great detail. Number three, so a detailed inventory of migratable assets. So this would be as part of the scoping session. This is really important to have this. This is basically your mapping matrix. So you are mapping your source assets to the destination assets in the new tenancy. So with company acquisitions, for example, there's bound to be duplications with sort of mailboxes, HR, finance, accounts, support app, for example. They all need to go somewhere else. This mapping document really is essential. Moving accounts to things like shared mailboxes for leavers and that kind of thing to save costs. Mapping out which licenses you're going to assign to these migratable assets. Any important notes around there as well, VIP users, for example. Also, when you're creating a lot of your scripts and remediation to bulk update things like mailbox permissions and things, you'll be basing these off this mapping spreadsheet because it's the single source of truth, and it will make life a lot easier going forward. Low stress really is the currency of a tenant migration. So that, yeah, the more effort you make there, the easier it's going to be. Number four, so good communication strategy. It's imperative that you actually, once you decided to go ahead with a tenant migration, you actually get your communication strategy nailed really early on. You want to be sending regular updates to your users about the migration that's due to come, and also instructions on how they can access the new tenancy, password resets, if they have to access any SSO and business applications, how to connect to virtual desktop, those kind of things. And even if you're actually asking your users to re-enroll their devices, for example, those communications will need to contain those instructions as well. And given the nature of users, they won't always open their emails and things like that as well. So making sure that we have different methods of communication, intranet sites, messages and payslips, all those kind of things about the move of to a new tenancy. That's really imperative. Number five, allow plenty of time to pre-sync data. So as what I mentioned before about the issues in throughput with the third-party tools, you really are in the hands of those tools. There's very little you can do outside of speeding those up, other than creating tickets, for example, to that to support for those vendors. Leaving plenty of time to do the pre-sync. This also gives plenty of time as well to build out any custom requirements, import and export Intune policies, and build up things like members of security groups, mailbox permissions, and so forth. It just gives plenty of time to maybe remediate any issues. Also, whilst you're doing pre-syncing, you can actually log into some of these mailboxes, for example, and just confirm data is as is, and everything's migrating across as it should. Number six, so this one is using Microsoft multi-geo licensing to meet data residency requirements. Yeah, we get many customers in different geographical locations purchasing organizations and acquiring businesses in different regions. For example, if a UK organization purchases a business in Germany, the first thing compliance and the IT team are going to say is, what about our data at rest policy? So with multi-geo licensing, you can apply these to mailboxes, groups, and SharePoint sites. And then you can simply choose which data center you want the data to live. So if a company outside the jurisdiction is acquiring your business, then use these licenses. They're relatively cheap, they're not expensive, and they'll help enterprises meet their data at rest requirements. Okay, so next we'll discuss the tenant migration and the approach to this. Appreciate this is quite busy, this diagram, but the main thing to concentrate on here is the blue boxes on the right hand side. So when we kind of decide that we need to kind of migrate between tenancies, we need to decide on the architecture approach. So there's three main ones there. The single event migration is by far the most populous. This is the one that we probably perform the most when we've worked with lots of customers. So pretty much almost everything is migrated across in one single event. Obviously, this is much higher risk. There are a lot shorter timelines. You're kind of giving yourself a very small window at the end to basically move everything over and get those users live in the target tenant. Microsoft will kind of recommend avoiding the single event migration once these migrations kind of hit the 15,000 seat mark, or if you're actually looking to move over 7 terabytes of site content data, although you can pre-sync some of that beforehand. Again, other factors that would determine whether you should go down the single event migration approach is obviously going to be data volumes, your network bandwidth, also your help desk capacity as well. That could be a huge limiting factor if you have to manually re-enroll thousands of devices across several sites or even across several geographical regions around the world. That really is going to be one of the factors on there as well. Next is the phase migration. So this is more of a gradual migration of users and services from source to target tenant. Source domains are obviously not transferred over. They can't coexist in tenancies at the same time. And users would just assume target domains for a short period of time. It's a lower risk, but there's longer timelines. And there also is limitations with coexistence. When you've got things like mail forwarding between the user's old mailbox and the new mailbox. Although it's the same company, because they're two tenants, the mail is classed as external, and that can actually bring in other problems as well. Next is the tenant split or tenant move, probably the least common approach that we see or we've had to work with. An example that we've had recently is a large enterprise had an internal charity. They actually moved out of the enterprise 365 tenancy and established their own. So there was a tenant split, and that was so that they could kind of do their own sharing and not have to adhere to the enterprise restraints that were actually enforced on that tenancy. So yeah, that can require additional work around establishing new identities and that kind of thing. Okay, so once you've decided on the event, then the next part is actually running through that migration. So in this example, we've picked the single event migration because it's by far the most common scenario when we're working with customers. So on the screen here, you can actually see that we've got a source tenancy or an organization, Contoso.com. They have an on-premise environment and a Microsoft 365 cloud environment. The users are synchronized via Azure AD Connect. So on-premise is the single source of authority when it comes to identity services. Contoso actually has an Exchange server on-premise as well. This is purely for management of those Exchange attributes. All of the mailboxes are actually in the cloud. It's purely from a management perspective as well. If you can see the UPN there, there's an example user, rob.thomas@contoso.com. Okay, so Contoso.com has been acquired by a larger organization, Fabricum.com, and now the task here is to migrate the contents of Contoso into the Fabricam tenancy. So looking at the numbers on the screen, we've got action number 1. So the first thing that will be done in this instance, after we've done obviously pre-scoping and so forth, we need to replicate the source identities into the destination AD domain. So we need to recreate those Contoso users into the Fabricam Active Directory. Best practice here, what we would normally do is recreate those accounts in a brand new OU. That way, all those users are contained when we need to run our management scripts and our remediation tasks. It's a lot easier when they're all contained within an OU as well. Again, if there's lots of group policy and restraints, we can do things like block inheritance and just make sure that we've got full control over those users. Once those users have been created, we can then synchronize those up from the target AD domain into the destination tenant. So again, using AD Connect directory synchronization. Those will then create those objects in the cloud, and then we can actually begin doing the tenant migration build out. So then we would apply things like licenses to the accounts. So they've got the services there ready. We would be doing all sorts of remediation tasks, mailbox permissions, for example. This is where all of what I call the scaffolding occurs, building out the team structures, the SharePoint sites and so forth, just getting everything ready. Once that's in place, so number 3, this would then be executing the pre-stage migration. So we'd start to synchronize that data across into the target environment to capture as much information as possible, so that when we've got the cutover event, there's only a small number of days that we have to synchronize over. Once that's all done and we're happy, we then got the cutover event. So this is when the stress begins. We would then have to stop AD Connect synchronization in contoso.com. I call this the point of no return, because once we kind of start doing this, then we really are kind of destined to move the workloads onto the destination tenant, because some of these steps are actually quite hard to undo or quite time consuming, although technically possible. So we stop AD Connect synchronization. This is so that we convert all of the users and objects in the Contoso domain to cloud only. And the reason why we do that is so that we can actually remove the domain from that tenant, so we can add it to the target tenant Fabricam. We can't do that until the objects are cloud only, because on-premise is the single source of authority. When we do that, we can actually start to remove the emails, the proxies, the aliases from all those objects in Contoso. We would run this manually with our scripts. You can go into the admin center and request that Microsoft does this automatically for you. 95% of the time, this actually gets stuck and can cause a lot of stress and maybe tickets to Microsoft to actually get this remediated. So the more that you do here, the much smoother the process is when we need to actually physically remove that domain from the tenancy. So we would follow best practice there. Once all that's done, we can actually register that domain in Fabricam.microsoft.com. So we can add contoso.com to that domain. Obviously, we need to do that to ensure legacy email still flows and so forth. Again, this process can take 30 minutes. It can happen instantaneously. Microsoft do document that this process it can get stuck, and again, this would require a ticket to Microsoft. If you do your due diligence and remove all of the domain entries across those objects properly, 99% of the time it works almost instantly. So again, making sure that you plan there properly. When the domain's in the target tenant, we can then simply just add the proxy addresses, update UPNs if we need to. Again, this would all be done in the on-premise domain environment and then synchronized up with AD Connect. This is where you have all of your scripts to hand, and you automate this process and make it as slick as possible. So you can just do this in half an hour, irrespectively of the number of objects that you've got to do. Then the final piece, so execute the final sync for all workloads and services. So once all that's done, any missing data you can just bring across in a final sync. And again, that should be a couple of days worth max. And again, that should be done in an hour or two. So yeah, at a high level, that's how a tenant migration is executed. There is quite a lot of steps as well in between there, and a lot of planning that goes into it. But that's how we kind of do a single event migration. Okay, so next we've actually got a case study of a tenant migration that we performed for a customer, Watkin Jones Group. So Watkin Jones, they're a leading UK developer of homes and affordable properties and co-living. They were established in 1791, so they've got over 200 years of experience. They actually established a sister company called Fresh Student Living in 2010, and by 2015, they had also produced over 28,000 beds across 88 sites for student accommodation here in the UK. So quite a large establishment. One of the main challenges was Fresh Student Living that obviously had its own Microsoft 365 tenancy, just caused huge issues accessing different workloads such as Microsoft Teams. It just led to inefficient communications as a result, really, and really hampered their collaboration. So Watkin Jones approached Valto with this problem, and he obviously identified that it was a complex project requiring technical expertise and support, and needed the ability to scale IT resource accordingly to make sure that this project got over the line. So some of the challenges. So obviously SharePoint information was difficult to browse and access securely across the two tenants. Collaboration on Teams between both organizations was quite cumbersome. It wasn't a good experience for the users. User management and general tenant administration was very inefficient with different practices established across both. So it was quite a headache for the IT teams operating those two tenancies. Also, Fresh Student Living users, they couldn't access the Watkin Jones domain. Watkin Jones had a large on-premise infrastructure, although most of it hosted on Azure, but there was a lot of applications and file servers that was needed there as well. There was also a large Azure subscription. Fresh Student Living had a large Azure virtual desktop infrastructure that needed to support several hundred concurrent users at once. Most of the students would access resources from the Azure virtual desktop. So this had to be included in the migration, in the single event migration, which added a lot of complexity. And there was also other resources in the subscriptions which duplicated billing, and obviously there was deficiencies in security policies and things. So Valto's solution, we focused on our 5-stage approach. So this is the pre-engagement, so conducting a series of meetings and understanding clients' requirements for the appropriate course of action. Then there's the consultation, so obviously deep dive workshops to fully understand all of the low-level requirements to document and create a plan of action to ensure successful delivery and adoption for this project. And then the build phase, obviously Valto delivered the environment merge, minimizing impact on users by carrying out any disruptive works out of hours, for example, and automating as much as possible. Then we've got the train, so possibly the most essential stage. So training ensured both organizations had full understanding of the solution across all levels of engagement, from administrators through to champions and end users, so making sure that they had everything they need. And then obviously support, so post-migration support ensured the clients felt confident with the projects that were delivered. Any kind of queries were handled via Valto, resulting in maximum satisfaction. Okay, so that's the case study. Before we go on to Q&A, there's actually an extra slide that I've popped in here. So this is just some general updates on some of the tenant migration. So I mentioned the industry standard tools, and the general consensus is that the third parties kind of dominate that market. Microsoft, in typical Microsoft fashion, is a bit late to the game, but they are actually trying to implement their own portfolio of products. So I mentioned before there was some cross-tenant user migration tools actually available now. They were limited to Exchange Online mailboxes, OneDrive for Business. And then there were SharePoint sites as well that was currently in preview. At the moment, these are all script-based with PowerShell commandlets, and the licensing is limited to enterprise agreements. But we can look at the cross-tenant shared data on the right-hand side here. They're actually developing tools that will migrate 365 groups. They're now looking at teams as well, so teams, chats, and meetings, teams and channels. The good thing about this is once they kind of develop those tool sets, they probably will start to develop APIs and expose those as well for third-party tool sets. So this is obviously a very positive thing. At the moment, there's no one solution that does this in the most effective way. Looking at the bottom, we've got supporting cross-tenant migration features. So the first one here is domain sharing for email. So a lot of these tools are in private preview, but the good indication for Microsoft that they'll be coming into public preview. I think it's going to be in Q4 this year. So domain sharing for email, this is quite an interesting one. So currently you cannot register a domain in 2 tenancies at the same time. It's completely impossible. With this new domain sharing feature, Microsoft are going to release some additional connectors that you can configure in the Exchange Admin Center that allow users to actually acquire additional domains for primary or secondary SMTP addresses. This is really good because we're going to be able to flag mail as internal still, even though it's in between 2 tenancies. It's going to reduce those kind of problems that we get with the coexistency. So yeah, that should be good when it comes out. Then we've got identity mapping, so kind of a way to automate the mapping between the 2 tenants. And then we've got the admin user interface there as well. So that's an admin UI for some of the migration elements in the top table. We're going to have a nice GUI in front of that as well, so that should be good. And then on the right-hand side, the single sign-on. So again, there's no private or public preview been announced yet, but it's something that's on their roadmap and they're currently working on, the ability to migrate single sign-on applications or again, use some coexistence between the 2 tenancies there. So that's some new features that are coming on. Okay, and final part. So we'll leave some time at the end of this now for some Q&A. So feel free to fire any questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to answer those. So there's actually a question here from Luke. When you move the Intune policies, I take it doesn't carry over assignments and filters. Yes, that's correct. You can export the policies using Graph API. There's loads of good PowerShell scripts on GitHub publicly available, and those will export those policies into JSON format. You'll then need to just run scripts to put the assignments back on. Again, if you use scripts to export the group members, that should be quite a slick process as well. We've also got 2 more questions. So first one is, what are the limitations of tenant coexistence? Good question. I guess first one would be user experience and productivity. So coexistence can impact the user's experience with things like Teams, having to switch between multiple tenants, and access resources on 2 different tenancies can be quite a poor experience. The biggest example I've seen of that is the NHS. So the NHS has its own single tenancy, and then there's thousands of GP surgeries and professional organisations who are part of the NHS that actually have their own smaller tenancies. And from speaking to those customers, it's kind of been a nightmare. They have 2 mailboxes. Their Teams meetings are often mismatched and they're logging into the wrong account when trying to access a team meeting. So yeah, that's definitely a limitation. Another question, I have a large Apple mobile device estate. Can I connect my Apple Business Manager devices to two Intune tenants? Unfortunately, no. If you want to switch your devices to a different Intune tenant, you actually need to unenroll them from the current one and then generate a new device enrollment token in the new tenant. So you can't just register two Intune MDM servers. So again, adds complexity, but it's something that we have done before. Another question from Luke. So can you export applications? You can't export apps, but again, if you're using things like Intune packages, then you should be able to just re-upload those with the same settings into an Intune tenancy. That shouldn't be too much of a hard task. There's also the new winget as well, where you can just use commands to install packages, similar to how Linux and Mac work. That could be an easier approach as well. Someone said, what would be the appropriate Microsoft 365 certification for this sort of task? I would say MS 100 or the new one 102. That's a good certification, which covers things like hybrid identity, so AD Connect, managing 365 subscriptions. That would be a good basis to for a certification based on this sort of task. Obviously, you'll need deep understanding of any traditional on-premise environment if that's into the mix as well. Good understanding of license SKUs, and then experience and understanding of the migration tool set as well. There isn't a certification that basically focuses on migration. It's just an administrative task, albeit a large one, that comes with the nature of 365 tenancies. That was from Anonymous. Okay, has anybody got any more questions at all? Okay, so we've got Ed, who's a new user of ShareGate. So found over the last 3 months that there's many issues with their updates. The latest being last week that where all local drive tasks were lost. As a long-term user, have you found this to be normal for them? Starting to regret the expensive 3-year commitment we signed up for now. We've used ShareGate quite a lot, mainly for custom SharePoint migration. We found the support quite good, but I can't say we've ever come into the scenario where an update has broken some of the jobs and tasks that are stored on there. I definitely recommend opening a ticket. They may be able to get those back from some of the configuration files. It's definitely worth having a look at that as well. Anonymous, so can you migrate the logs? You can export 365 audit logs. You can't re-import them into a new tenancy, but you could definitely keep them on record. You could stream them to Azure log analytic workspaces to be kept, but you'd obviously have to trawl through those manually if you needed to look at some of the audit logs on there as well. Okay. Does anybody else have any final questions? I'll give it one more minute and then we'll end the webinar there. The recording will be sent out to all attendees and it'll also be posted onto our social channels. I think by tomorrow, it should be gone on there as well. Brilliant. Thank you all for attending and thank you for listening. Have a good day.